The United States has a strategic oil reserve, a gold reserve, and mountains of US dollars. So why not a Bitcoin reserve? Sounds funny at first, but the more you think about it, the more it makes sense. Because we're living in a world where money is no longer tied to gold, but to trust. And trust, as we know, is never stable. In the past, people stored tangible things, gold, silver, land. But today, people are starting to store things no one can actually hold, like Bitcoin. And anything that's scarce, hard to reproduce, and trusted during times of instability, eventually becomes a safe haven asset. Just look at Bitcoin. Love it or hate it, millions of people see it as digital gold. Which raises the question, should the US, the country that prints money like it's playing a game and dominates the global dollar system, officially reserve Bitcoin as a strategic asset? Think about it. From oil and gold to treasury bonds, soft power, and global trust, the US already holds the full combo. After the 1973 oil shock, when OPEC tightened the taps and the West choked, the US woke up and built the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, SPR, massive underground caverns filled with over 700 million barrels of oil. But it didn't stop there. The US went big, hoarding thousands of tons of gold, foreign bonds, IMF SDRs, and of course, an unimaginable amount of freshly printed dollars. Why? One word: control. Won't buy oil? Use the dollar. Borrow from the IMF? Dollar. Make an international transfer? Dollar again. This world is, essentially, a poker game where the US holds the dealer's seat. But every system has a weakness. And in this one, the weak spot is trust. You can't keep printing money and expect people to believe in it forever. The Fed has been injecting liquidity for over a decade. The budget's bleeding, inflation's rising, and the dollar, once a symbol of power, is starting to feel like a burden. People are getting nervous. And when they're nervous, they look for alternatives: gold, land, precious metals, and increasingly, Bitcoin. What was once called a joke is now seriously being considered by investors, hedge funds, and even politicians. To be honest, I used to think Bitcoin was a bubble, a fantasy, something that would burst sooner or later. Just like I once thought I'd never buy anything online. But the market teaches you painful lessons. Anything enough people believe in becomes valuable. And once something has value, it gets stored. And once it's stored, it eventually becomes part of strategic reserves. So the real question is, who moves first? The US is no fool. They know that if Bitcoin truly becomes a financial safe haven, not owning it is a fatal strategic flaw. When global trust in the dollar fades and the traditional system begins to wobble, the US will face a choice: keep denying it or quietly accumulate it. And frankly, I believe they may have already started, just not announced it yet. If I were a strategist in Washington, I'd definitely allocate a slice of national reserves into a cold wallet. Not much, just enough to secure a seat at the new table. Because reserves aren't for daily use. Therefore, when everything else falls apart, and in a decentralized, globalized future, owning some Bitcoin won't be a matter of if, but when. I still remember reading about Bitcoin back in 2014, when it was a hot item, traded on black markets, hacked every other week. But even then, some believed money shouldn't be state-issued. That Bitcoin was modern gold. That someday, no one would control global finance. At the time, I thought, yeah, just more conspiracy theories. But now I see I was naive. Interestingly, some US politicians are already voicing support for the idea. The most prominent? Senator Cynthia Lummis. She bought Bitcoin when it was just a few $1,000s and listed it in her personal assets. Her stance is clear. A smart nation should own assets others can't control. And Bitcoin is a top candidate in a digital world. Now it's the elite's turn to step in. Strategic think tanks, normally focused on trade wars or financial sanctions, are now modeling digital reserves. It may sound new, but the logic is familiar. Just as you need gold to hedge inflation, nations might need Bitcoin in case the traditional system shakes. Not to replace it, just add a cushion. Like keeping cash at home alongside your bank account. The beauty of Bitcoin is that it doesn't require gold vaults, oil tankers, or armed guards. Just a hard drive, an offline computer, a safe, and someone who doesn't forget their passphrase. The US has always led in setting standards for what's next. And if they adopt Bitcoin, it's not just about an asset. It's a message. The rules of the game have changed. But why the US and not El Salvador or Argentina? Countries already holding Bitcoin. El Salvador legalized it, which made headlines. But with a GDP under $30 billion, it's mostly a crypto news item. The US, on the other hand, has the money and the system. A global banking network. Financial institutions that command worldwide respect. If those titans declare they're accumulating Bitcoin, the market will shake. Argentina, too, sees Bitcoin as a hedge against inflation. But they lack the financial weight to move global tides. Even if they hoard tens of thousands of Bitcoins, the Fed still meets, the ECB still prints. Only when a giant moves, the world follows. And that giant is the United States. The Fed can inject global liquidity with a phone call. The US dollar remains the most used currency on Earth. Giants like BlackRock and Fidelity are headquartered in the US, managing trillions across the planet. If the US embraces Bitcoin, this wouldn't just be an investment, it would be a political statement. A signal that central banks around the world would be forced to analyze carefully. Just like the world once scrutinized gold when the US stockpiled it, or how the dollar gained global trust by being backed by the world's #1 economy. I still remember the day BlackRock filed for a Bitcoin ETF. They weren't the first, but because it was BlackRock, the market shook. Bitcoin prices soared. The entire ecosystem came alive again. So what would happen if the US Treasury suddenly announced that 1% of its national reserves would be allocated to Bitcoin? Maybe we can't predict the exact price reaction, but one thing's certain. Central banks around the world would call emergency meetings. At that point, the question isn't whether to buy Bitcoin. It's whether to buy now or wait and pay much more later. El Salvador can shout from the rooftops and no one listens. But if the US so much as whispers, the crypto market holds its breath. That's when Bitcoin officially transitions from a risky plaything to a legitimate strategic asset, like gold during wartime or oil during a crisis. The kind of asset nations must include in their foreign exchange reserve portfolios. We'd witness a full-blown digital gold rush at the level of central banks. National balance sheets will begin listing Bitcoin alongside bonds, gold, and major foreign currencies. And the traditional financial system would need to restructure. When Bitcoin becomes a strategic reserve asset, everything changes. Accounting standards, risk models, custody protocols, taxation frameworks. Finance ministries would need blockchain experts on speed dial. Investment funds would overhaul their strategies. And institutions like the IMF and BIS, who once mocked Bitcoin, would have no choice but to study it seriously. In this new world, soft power would belong to nations that hold enough Bitcoin, not just those with powerful armies or massive GDPs. And if the US takes the lead, the global financial system would begin shifting toward Bitcoin, just like it once shifted toward the dollar after World War II. But if the US hesitates, countries like China, the UAE, or smaller, more nimble nations could start quietly accumulating first. If that happens, the US wouldn't be the rule maker anymore. It would be just another player forced to follow the new rules. Here's a critical point. What if Bitcoin regulations are signed into law by Donald Trump himself? The US could lead by example, creating a clear, long-term legal framework for Bitcoin. It can't be treated as a double-edged sword, used as a scapegoat for money laundering one day, then praised as digital gold the next. Bitcoin must be legally defined as a strategic asset, regulated like gold, but operated like a digital one. It needs to be audited, recorded on national balance sheets, insured, custodied, and inspected, just like the 8,100 tons of gold held at Fort Knox. This isn't easy, but if they're serious, they need to standardize the rules, so governments can act decisively without the fear of lawsuits. As for storage infrastructure, Bitcoin isn't kept in vaults, it lives in private keys. The US would need a top-tier security system, on par with nuclear weapon storage. Distributed multi-signature networks across multiple states, military-grade encryption, and multi-layer protection. Because if a private key falls into the wrong hands, it becomes a financial weapon, capable of crippling the entire economy. A single security breach could render the national Bitcoin reserve useless, or worse, stolen. Such risk is simply unacceptable at the state level. If the US wants to implement a dollar-cost averaging (DCA) strategy for Bitcoin, it will need a clear roadmap and solid financial logic. Bitcoin purchases should be part of a broader asset diversification plan, just like how they manage bonds, gold, and foreign currencies. This move would drive Bitcoin's price upward and force other nations to reevaluate their own reserve strategies. Because when the country that prints the world's strongest currency starts buying an inflation hedge, it signals that a new chapter in global finance has begun. And this new chapter is not for those who still think crypto is a joke. So there you have it. Everything you need to know about the idea of a US Bitcoin reserve. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next video.